Welcome to What the Duck, a podcast with real experts talking about direct spin challenges and experiences. And now, here's your host, SourceDay's very own manufacturing maven, Sarah Scudder.
Thank you for joining me for What the Duck, another supply chain podcast brought to you by SourceDay. I'm your host, Sarah Scudder, and this is the podcast for people working in the direct materials part of supply chain. I'm at Sarah Scudder on LinkedIn and at S. Scudder on Twitter. Today, I'm going to be joined by Robert Seifert, and we're going to discuss how to find additional cost savings. If you work for a manufacturer and are looking for ways to save money, then this episode is for you. Robert is a senior buyer with Good Sense Foods. He manages flexible and rigid packaging as well as commodity spend. He has led several successful cost-saving initiatives throughout his career. Welcome to the show, Robert. I want to go back in time and have you share a little bit about your personal story and how you got your start in manufacturing.
So I was going to school, or college, I should say, for mathematics, and I was planning on becoming an actuary, so dealing with insurance risk. And I was just a big math guru and kind of wanted to go that route, something in analysis. As I was graduating college, going into possibly my master's degree, I had a kid. So my first kid.
Big life change.
So big life change. I opted out to not go for my master's degree and wanted to get a job. So I got hired on by Angie's Boom Chicka Pop at the time, working as an inventory analyst for about a year. And then a guy by the name of Dean Giroux, actually, who I work with now, hired me on as the inventory analyst. And then shortly after that, like I said, a year later, I was promoted to buyer, was pulled into corporate, really had no experience, and started in that room, right? And so at the time, it was more like being managed by a individual overseeing every step of every move you make, and then gradually kind of lean to you're taking over things, right? And so that was more like buying a lot of popcorn, sugar, salt, and packaging and corrugated. Pretty simple. And then later on, so that was like at the onset of this company starting really, so backing it up a little bit. It was a newer company and they had been around a couple of years and they got this big Costco promotion right about the time I was coming on. And so it was launching from like one shift to essentially like almost 24/7, 3 different shifts. And at the time I was becoming this buyer. And so it became a little bit complex, to say the least, but learned a lot.
You mentioned at the very start of your career, you started as something called an inventory technician. So what specifically did you do in this role? Because that's not a term I hear a lot.
So more like an inventory analyst, but so what I was doing was closing jobs out and ensuring inventory accuracy. So production jobs for WIP or finished goods, I was essentially overseeing them and then ensuring inventory was placed into these jobs accurately, as well as like analyzing which jobs are producing more waste and then trying to go after some type of improvement around that.
And in that role, so inventory was your world. What was the biggest pain point that you were dealing with, and how did you make improvements or solve some of the challenges? Because managing inventory is tough.
Yeah, so when we were early on, it was a lot of Excel spreadsheets. And so lot traceability was a big thing, right? And so that was pretty tough. And so we implemented, or at the time I first started there, I worked with a guy named Joe Hears that worked on implementing PeopleSoft at the time. So that was a challenge in and of itself to like launch this new MRP ERP system. And then nobody there had used one really, and making that work, right? So it was a big challenge, but it ended up helping us out, saving us a lot of time.
Then you were promoted to something called an inventory control analyst. And one of the things that you did in this role was manage the internal materials schedule. Again, another very, very tough role. Right? You don't get a lot of credit or kudos when things are running smoothly, but something goes wrong and everything blows up, right? And it's a disaster and the end of the world. So what was your strategy for managing your materials?
So at that time, I wasn't the buyer of the materials. So if I would bring it into a warehouse off site, and then we got to manage them from the site to the location, right? And so it was really like, we have X amount of space, X product, typically will run on X number of or Y number of lines. It typically runs on one or two. So we had 4 lines at the time. So then we ended up having 5 eventually. But so you would factor in what's the runtime on this certain product, what's the pounds per hour or cases per hour, and then build your racking accordingly, right? So high running items, lowering the racking closer to the point of use type of situation. But yeah, it was like breaking down the amount of space into X number of items and how frequently they're used, and so it was difficult too because we had a truck that came like every 3 hours. And so it had to be like, we had a very tight facility too. We only had like 100 and some spots for inventory. And so
when you say a truck came every 3 hours, you mean a new delivery came, or a truck came every 3 hours that was picking up product for your customers?
It was like 2 to 3 hours, but it was product that was outgoing from our production facility. So finished product would go to the warehouse, and on the return trip, it would deliver materials. And so we had to time it to keep our racks full in the warehouse and not run out of material. This is a very limited space at our production facility. It was super small. So that's why we had to have everything delivered off site and then shipped over. And so it was really just managing those materials. But yeah, strategy was all about, runtime, frequency, and breaking it apart based on number of items.
So the theme of our discussion today is around cutting costs and finding kind of additional ways to save money that aren't so obvious. And I feel like you started doing this very, very early on in your career. So when you were serving in this role as an inventory control analyst, how did you work with your team to help save the company money?
A lot of ways. So we had to look at not only like warehouse space. So like, for instance, we had too much warehouse space that we were paying for. And so it was like refining the needle as to what we need to carry given the lead time to support the customer's demand and planning demand, right? And so there was a lot of like, let's look at customer order frequency, let's look at incoming materials, let's look at it as a whole, and then break it apart and cut down 50% of the space and make it work.
Okay.
And so you're obviously you're paying for a lot less warehouse space, right? You're trying to eliminate touches to things of that matter to improve efficiencies, and a lot of that in the inventory analyst role. Later on in life, though, it became more like when I was a buyer, I was working in lean supply chain. So that's where a lot of the continuous improvement methodologies kind of came from, and the success, I guess.
After you served in this inventory control analyst role, you became a procurement specialist and you purchased a lot of corrugated packaging. What was the hardest part when you were buying or managing this category?
Vendor relationships with some tough suppliers, and then ultimately like get sick of dealing with that, so you reach out or you bid out the business to a more efficient supplier, and then hopefully at a better cost, right? In that case, it was. So we were with like Green Bay and one of the smaller companies, we'll say, and then we moved into the realm of the WestRock and the International Papers of the world, and just saw service level go way up in comparison. I'm not saying that Green Bay was bad. I'm saying some others that we had were bad, but so no knock to any corrugated companies, just different service levels. And one of the biggest issues we had was for a Costco project, we were doing these trays with X dividers in them, and we put like 38 bags that were 18 ounces, I believe they were. And the design really wasn't done by an engineer, let's say, right? It was kind of more supplier related, and they're relying on their expertise, right? And so what ultimately happened was these things were getting damaged in transit, they're falling apart, they're breaking. And so we increased the design, or we, reached out to engineering, right? Later on, in the progression of this thing, right? And try to get some help, see what we could do, right? And so we redid this design for another large Costco MPM. And so it was like 10,000 pounds or something like that. We put it in our warehouse and the humidity got to it. And if you've ever watched the bottle or the YouTube video where the forklift driver goes in and grabs the bottles and all of them fall over, that was this type of scenario. And so it became like all hands on deck to what we do. What do we do to fix this? And we got to pay more money to get a better design. Yeah, it was a struggle. It was a struggle from like getting enough people to fix this in time, getting the design corrected, uh, satisfying the customer still. And in the end, we kept the business and they still have the business with them. So
it's a good reminder of why not to cut corners and don't only focus on cost.
Yeah. When you're a small company, I think you just think that you can rely on some folks, and sometimes that second opinion is very valuable.
Mm-hmm. So you were promoted from a procurement specialist to a buyer planner role. What were the biggest direct to materials challenges you faced in this role?
So it was going from, like, I kind of went through this in the beginning too. I kind of rushed through all the titles, kind of laid them into inventory analyst and then buyer, right? But the procurement specialist was more that, like, hey, you're kind of learning the ropes. We'll give you a few things to buy. And then the buyer realm was more like, hey, I'm going to manage this contractual spend from my manager's standpoint, and you're going to do everything else, right? And then at the same point, we brought on co-manufacturers. So we had co-manufacturers in the West Coast. We had them in Phoenix. And then we had some in northern Minnesota and Perham, and then we had some out on the East Coast in Ohio. And so the big challenge was like managing all of that from like being fresh, and then also the time zone differential. So it was like starting work at 5 a.m. and ending work at 8 p.m. because people are calling you at all different hours of the night. We also had 24/7 operations, so I had folks calling me in the middle of the night. And a lot of it was like, can't find this inventory. And, you have a system that's tracking that, and it says it's supposed to be there. Why don't you put it there? Then they end up finding it, right? But yeah, that was a big challenge, just taking on so much at once, so many different locations, with so many different items. And at the time, like when I started procurement, especially, was just buying like popcorn, sugar, salt, and oil, right? Well, then it became like we got to buy chocolate drizzled items, and I got to buy stuff for the MPD teams, and I got to buy, so the list goes on, right? And there's just a lot of challenges in growth and development.
Yeah. In this role as a buyer, what cost saving strategy did you implement that you felt had a big impact at the company?
Well, so like the first one I did was pallets. I just picked an easy goer. Like we were paying out the wazoo for pallets. So that was a quick one. We also so that was wood. I kind of differentiate them into two, like wood and blue or wood and chip.
And what did you do? How did you cut costs without impacting production or quality?
Negotiation with current volume and growth. And, I leveraged that against the chip of the world and got them down to a flat rate instead of rental fees, and it ended up saving like $100,000. Not a big one, but just a nice little start to the career, right? And then from there, it was like different corrugated or flexible spending improvements.
You transitioned to a company where you were a materials planner. So again, all kind of in the buying realm, a lot of direct, but progression in your career. So what was the most important part of your job as a materials planner?
So that was right at the acquisition where ConAgra procured Andrews Bean Sugar Pop. And so that's what they kind of call their buyers. Well, they had commodities managers that worked at corporate and then buyers. So I no longer really was managing any commodities. It was just managing the flexible the flexible packaging and corrugated. So they kind of left that in my realm. And then I would buy off of their contracts for the other remaining commodities. But it was a heavy focus on, okay, at the time I had to buy let me step back. We had also implemented a facility in Reno, Nevada.
And when you say facility, was this a manufacturing facility?
Brand new manufacturing facility in Reno, kind of in the process of all those co-mans and in my transition, right? And so I no longer had to procure for the co-manufacturers. I just had to procure for my facility and the Reno, Nevada facility. So where they direct owned, right? And so that was one piece of the puzzle. So with the co-manufacturers, a little more turnkey, so it's a little easier. With another facility of ours that I had to purchase, it was purchasing everything for them, so it was a little bit much. And then at the same time, they have a lean or a CPS, a continuous improvement system, or continuous performance system, where they break apart these pillars. And one of the pillars I owned was lean supply chain, and so I had to formulate a team with our production planner, a warehouse manager, and then several subject matter experts, depending on what the improvement projects were. But the idea was that you would spend 50% of your time on the floor and you do improvement projects. So I own the lean supply chain. I had to mentor the lean supply chain to the Reno facilities manager over there so they could implement it. And then I also own the changeover daily management system. So any line that changes over a product, I'm working on improvements to do that, right? So lean supply chain covered like a lot of schedule adherence, schedule attainment, case fill, finished good, non-finished good, day supplies, and dollars. And so it was improvements around those, but it was mainly we had key objectives as a team, and then how do we relate up into those to improve them, right? So if a team was working on, let's say, an AMD team or an autonomous machine development team was working on improving case fill by like improving the scale, right? So they break the scale apart. Mind you, we join these teams then too, but we go down there before we break the whole scale apart, we clean it, we inspect it, we detect it, we correct it, and then we perfect it, right? So it's all about kind of that process in the lean supply chain and then in the changeover daily management system. From a buyer standpoint, it wasn't really about a lot of like improvement in there. It was really just staying tight to what you said your goal for day supply and dollars will be for your budget.
And what would you say? I mean, improvement obviously is an internal kind of cost savings in that you're doing more, right, with the same or less resources. Was there anything that stands out though that was from a hard dollar cost savings that you were able to garnish from these process improvements?
Well, hard dollar is hard to put on it, but we caught our changeover times from like 6 minutes down to a minute and a half. So a lot of uptime, a lot of case fill improvement. And also like on some of these AMD teams, you're taking a bagger that's running pretty poorly or a machine that's the key focal point of your production facility, and you're taking it and improving it, making it run a lot better, breaking down a lot less. So it's hard to put a real number on those cost savings improvements.
You work in the food industry still, which is a tough space to be because you're buying things that have what I call short life materials. So things that can expire, go bad. You've got to have demand planning and forecasting really buttoned up because you buy too much, you're going to be throwing things out because it's going to expire or no longer be good. What is your demand planning strategy now, given that you have such short life materials and things that you're purchasing?
From a buyer standpoint, I won't speak specifically to the company I work at, but this is my approach typically anywhere is what's that historical look like on an existing item, right? So what's the historical look like? Is it trending up or down? And then what's the shelf life on that product, right? And it's really, and then you also have a space constraint too, typically, right? So you got to mix the two, a meshing of the two to formulate basically like that line in the sand, right? Or like your minimum inventory, your safety stock. So a lot of it's been, minimum inventory, safety stock triggered, but like on your existing items, heavy selling items, you want to contract or try to contract as much as you can, right? To try to get that price point down. But unlike some of the riskier items, it becomes, maybe we order a little less and pay a little more, right? So we don't sit on it as long. Or maybe we bring in that MLQ if needed, and that's all we're doing just to keep the risk down or the shelf life from aging. So there's just like a lot of strategies. Just depends on the product, right?
Technology has come quite a long way since you started your career. How have you been able to leverage technology to help find more cost savings?
I gave an example previously how we leveraged the ERP system, right? And then we obviously leveraged SAP too, right? So previous to those, it was a lot of like manual scorecards, manual data tracking, manual metric tracking, and then implementing lead, for instance, at our plant, give those details behind the baggers, right? When are they down? What are they down for? And then you can analyze these.
Any other tips or tricks that you can share with the audience? So our target is small, mid-sized manufacturers, people who are, being very, very cost conscious while at the same time don't want to impact their quality or impact their timelines to their customers.
Keep people in the right positions within the company so that you can make the right decisions. Not only that, then key processes develop so that people are staying in line and structure right. Without the two, you get a bit of a chaotic environment. But then from like a buyer standpoint, it's just really digging into the data. You got to dive into data, see what you like. I see a lot of people just making repeated. So I've worked with a lot of buyers and I just see them making buys without ever trying to negotiate. And so I think there's always room for negotiation to save whatever you can for your company. And so the more you negotiate, the more you're going to save, right? So that's another trick. People are afraid to negotiate. They just ask for a price and the supplier tells them a price and they don't kick back and they just relay costs. And I think there's a lot of room within that.
Robert, thank you for coming on our show today. If you missed anything, you can check out the show notes. You can find us by typing in What the Duck, another supply chain podcast in Google. To have optimal search results, make sure to add another supply chain podcast at the end of your search. This brings us to the end of another episode of What the Duck, another supply chain podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Scudder, and we'll be back next week.